Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to another Family Roots. I'm super excited you're here with us today. And I am looking forward to the day when we can all be back together and play our games and have our lesson face to face. But sadly, that is out of my control. And sometimes when life feels out of control, it's easy to forget that God is still in control. We might even wonder if God can even help us. And as you hear more of Joseph's story today, I want to keep our big picture question in mind. And of course, that question is there anything that God cannot do? The answer is that God can do all things according to his character. So we've been learning about the nation that God was forming through the family of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And God even changed Jacob's name to Israel, which was the name of his chosen people. God used Jacob and his family, and he settled them back in the land of Canaan. And as we heard last week, Jacob ended up having something like 12 sons. Well, exactly 12 sons. And the sons didn't always get along. If you remember, Jacob had a favorite son. His name was Joseph, and the rest of his brothers hated Joseph because he was treated as a favorite. And so they went to the extreme and they sold Joseph into slavery. And Joseph ended up in Egypt. So let's find out what happens to him today as we check out our Bible story. Parents, if you want to follow along, this Bible story comes from Genesis chapters 39 to 41. It's a big old chunk. But the story goes that the travelers who bought Joseph took him to Egypt, and they sold him into an Egyptian officer's household, and the officer was named Potiphar. And God was with Joseph, and he made him really successful at everything he did. Potiphar put Joseph in charge as his personal assistant, right? The slave became Potiphar's personal assistant. That was quite the promotion. But one day, Potiphar's wife tried to get Joseph to sin against God and to sin against Potiphar. And Joseph refused. And then Potiphar's wife got really, really mad and she accused Joseph of doing something that he didn't do. And Potiphar believed his wife, and Joseph went to jail. But God was still with Joseph and he blessed him. And the jail warden then put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners. And one night, two other prisoners, they came to Joseph, and it was Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker. And both of them had dreams, and they told Joseph about the dreams they had. The cupbearer dreamed about a vine with 3 branches, and the cupbearer squeezed them into a cup and gave it to Pharaoh. And then the baker dreamed about 3 baskets of bread on his head, and the top basket had baked goods for Pharaoh. And the birds were coming and eating all the bread in the top basket. And so Joseph told them what the dreams meant. Joseph said that in 3 days, the cupbearer would serve Pharaoh again. But the baker wouldn't, because in 3 days, the baker was going to be put to death. And so Joseph asked the cupbearer to remember him and tell Pharaoh that Joseph did not deserve to be in prison. And so the cupbearer went and he served Pharaoh, but he forgot about Joseph. For 2 years, he forgot about Joseph. But 2 years later, Pharaoh had 2 dreams. And Pharaoh saw that 7 fat cows were eaten by 7 skinny cows. And 7 fat heads of grain were eaten by 7 thin heads of grain. And no one knew what these dreams meant. But finally, the cupbearer then remembered Joseph. And God told Joseph what Pharaoh's dreams meant. And Joseph explained the dreams to Pharaoh. The dreams represent 7 years of plenty, 7 years of an abundance of food, 7 years of a lot of food, followed by 7 years where no food would grow. And he said, you should choose someone to save food during the good years to use during the bad years. And Pharaoh realized that God was with Joseph. So he made Joseph second in command in all of Egypt. Talk about another huge promotion. So no one was more powerful than Joseph except for Pharaoh himself. So Joseph stored away food during the good years, and when the famine came, when the food wasn't growing anymore, people from every land came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph. You see, God sent Joseph to Egypt and blessed him, and he rose to a position of great authority, and God used Joseph to help Joseph's families and many, many others. And likewise, Jesus came to earth. He gave up his position of honor in heaven to be the savior of the world. So Joseph's experience in Egypt was a little bit like a roller coaster. There were really low lows and there were really high highs. Joseph was sold as a slave, low, to an important man named Potiphar, but God was with Joseph. And God made Joseph successful, and Potiphar put Joseph in charge of everything in Potiphar's life. Back up to high, right? And then Potiphar's wife accused Joseph of something that he did not do. And Joseph went back to jail, really low again. But God was with Joseph in prison, and by the time Joseph was about 28 years old, how did God help Joseph? Well, God gave Joseph the ability, the power to understand dreams. When two of Pharaoh's servants, the cupbearer and the baker, ended up in prison and had dreams in prison, Joseph told them what the dreams meant. But sadly, the cupbearer forgot about Joseph and he stayed in prison. And could Joseph get out of prison? Let's answer that big picture question again. Is there anything God cannot do? God can do all things according to his character. So 2 years later, after Joseph tells the cupbearer what his dream means, after Joseph says, "Hey, remember me," Pharaoh had a dream that no one could interpret. And finally, the cupbearer remembered Joseph. And Joseph explained that the dream meant that a famine was coming. And Pharaoh made Joseph second in command of all of Egypt. And that roller coaster, he's back to the top again. So during the years of plenty, Joseph saved up food in Egypt. Then during the years of famine, everyone came to Egypt for the food that they needed. So we see in this story how God sent Joseph to Egypt for a purpose. How God sent Joseph to Egypt and blessed him so that he rose to this position of great authority, so that he rose to be second in command of all of Egypt. From the prison to the palace, God used Joseph to help Joseph's family and many, many others. So likewise, when Jesus came to earth, he gave up his position of honor, coming from heaven to earth to be the savior of the world. So today's Bible story comes today's Bible story is found in 3 chapters in Genesis, chapters 39 to 41. And I want to read for you Genesis chapter 40, verse 8. It says, "We both had dreams," they answered, "but no one can tell us what they mean." Then Joseph said to them, "Only God knows what dreams mean. Tell me your dreams." God was with Joseph. Even when he was in prison, God was still with Joseph, and we saw that in our story today. God gave Joseph the power to understand dreams. And after Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dreams, Pharaoh made Joseph a really important guy in Egypt. So our first question today is, where does wisdom come from? How can we have wisdom and understanding? James 1:5, it says, "If any of you needs wisdom, you should ask God for it. He will give it to you. God gives freely to everyone and doesn't find faults." A lot of time, wisdom can come from age and experience, but that's not always the case. True wisdom comes from God, and true wisdom is understanding how life works best. And who better to understand that than God himself, because God created everything. and God gives wisdom to anyone who asks for it. So how did Joseph have confidence to become the second most powerful ruler in Egypt? Hebrews chapter 13, verse 6 says that we can say boldly, "The Lord helps me, I will not be afraid. What can mere humans do to me?" Joseph trusted in God's plan for his life. Joseph believed the dreams from God that meant that one day he would be a ruler. And he trusted that God would see him through. Even when he went through that roller coaster of a life, the highs and lows, he trusted God through all of those. Joseph was in prison for more than 2 years. So how can we trust God's timing in our life? Romans chapter 5, verse 6 says, "And just at the right time, Christ died for ungodly people. He died for us when we had no power of our own." God is in control. He sees the bigger picture and he works everything toward that bigger picture. Remember, he does everything for his glory and our good. And God's timing is always perfect, even when we don't understand it. And that's something that Joseph had to learn. Joseph was in prison for 2 more years than he thought he should be, but God used those 2 years to mold and make Joseph into the man that he needed to be to help rule over all of Egypt and get the world, not just Egypt, but get the world through the famine that God was bringing. Guys, we really miss you, and I hope that you're staying safe. And I really hope that we get to see you soon.